All right, we're gonna talk about ASUS's GeForce RTX 3080 Ti Strix OC liquid-cooled graphics card. It's like there's a competition for the longest name you can have for a graphics card. They actually had something very similar to this with the 6800 XT for the Radeon series, and we already talked about that. We're gonna show you today what happens when you take a 240 AIO, you pluck it onto a Strix card, and you just go.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
All right, so this is the GeForce RTX 3080 Ti Strix OC liquid cooled from ASUS. They made one of these for the 6800 XT, I believe the 6900 XT as well. This is obviously the NVIDIA variant of that. Now, 3080 Ti has been around for 6 months or so. It came out at the beginning-ish of this year. It's kind of like taking the place of the 3080, to be honest, and it's really obsoleted the need of a 3090 because it runs the same core as both, but it's just as fast as a 3090 and it's less expensive. But with that said, it kind of occupies an interesting spot. Let's sort of talk about some of the specs real quick. It's exactly the same as any other 3080 Ti. It's got your 12 gigabytes of GDDR6X memory. It's got half of what a 3090 does, but remember, it's the exact same core as a 3090. It just has 256 less CUDA cores and half the VRAM. Now, in terms of VRAM speed and all that, it's exactly the same as a 3090. So that's why most of our benchmarks, if you compared the 3080 Ti Founders Edition to the 3090 Founders Edition video that we did, it was within like 2 or 3%. Unfortunately, price-wise, it was priced much closer to a 3090 than it was to a 3080, even though it was like right in the middle of a 3080-3090 split. But when you add a water cooler, or in this case, a 240 AIO water cooler with very long sleeved cables, or tubes, I should say, which the sleeve is kind of loose, by the way. I kind of want to point that out right away. It seems like the sleeve's a little longer than the tube, therefore it sort of scrunches it and has this kind of an ugly accordion gap, which is kind of unfortunate, but I digress. You get a core that runs notoriously hot with high wattage demands. Remember, the stock 3090/3080 Ti is a 350 watt part, and then once you start overclocking it, that pushes itself up near 400 watts very quickly, very easily. So having an AIO or any sort of water cooler at this point is going to give you higher boost clocks for a longer average. They're probably still gonna come down a little bit over time. However, the other components that are known to be very, very hot in these cards are the power delivery and the RAM. So you still have a blower style cooler right here, which does have a heat plate and a cold plate touching things like the VRM power delivery as well as the VRAM. So you've got this blow through style that's gonna push that hot air out the back of the card through a fairly tiny exhaust port. Remember, it's not having to really cool the GPU core itself, which is the hottest component in terms of space. The VRMs get pretty hot as well, but they're a little more spread out. So you do have crossflow across the PCB to keep those components cool. Unlike the RTX 3090, there are no VRAM chips on the back of the card. So the backplate that's on here is gonna be mostly aesthetic. But if you take a look at this card, they clearly made this very exotic-y looking. You've got a lot of shiny plastic bits, and it is plastic, it's not metal. As you start to wipe it and sort of rub it down and keep it clean, you could potentially scratch it because it is all polished and shiny. Same thing with the backplate right there. But it has all the exact same features that you would find on the standard air-cooled Strix card. You got your P mode and your what they call it, Q mode, which are the different fan profiles, essentially, and noise profiles. You have 3 8-pin PCI Express power ports on this. And on the back, like you would typically find, you do have your 2 fan headers, and this one does not have an additional RGB header. Speaking of RGB, obviously there's RGB all over this card. And you have 2 120 millimeter RGB fans on the cooler right here, which do have, I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of get this out of the way. This is not exactly the cleanest implementation of this, especially if this is gonna be sitting anywhere visible in your case, which a radiator would, whether it's at the top or at the front. I feel like ASUS could have done a better job at this. I mean, I like that they sleeved the cables down through the RGB cables and the fan power cables down through the sleeve right here, because the fans as well as the RGB is controlled by GPU Tweak and ASUS Aura through the graphics card itself. So you don't have to go into the motherboard header to control it. You don't have to hook all of this up by just plugging the card onto the PCI Express slot is going to give you control over fan speed and lighting through GPU Tweak 2. Now, out of the box, it's obviously set to Rainbow Puke. I just think because this is all proprietary, they could have maybe come up with something a little bit neater here so that this flailing mess isn't sitting there. When you talk about a product that's as expensive as this is, these are oversights that shouldn't happen right there. That just kind of comes off as lazy in my mind. Now, in terms of the MOSFET design on the back, or excuse me, the capacitors, it is a full MLCC design, which you saw with the standard air-cooled Strix, so that just really kind of persists through the water-cooled card. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about how it performs. Now, we compared it to the RTX 3090 Founders Edition card and the RTX 3080 Ti Founders Edition card. The reason for that is we don't really have very many 3080 Ti's, and this is only the third one that we have, so we don't have a lot of aftermarket cards to compare it to, nor do we have an air-cooled card to compare it to, but, well, at least not the air-cooled Strix card. So by comparing it to the Founders Edition card, which is a custom PCB, higher power limit, higher power design, higher boost clocks than a reference card, we felt that the Founders Edition card was a good baseline to give us a comparison as to how adding a water cooler to your 3080 Ti can make it compared to a more expensive card and one that sits right at the exact same, product category. So with that said, here's how it performs. So it should be no surprise, it's pretty much matching and beating the RTX 3090 Founders Edition card in many tests, but that's because of the fact that obviously with the water cooler and the more aggressive boost clocks, because when you keep the core cooler, you can run a higher core clock for longer, there should be no surprise whatsoever that a water-cooled 3080 Ti is handedly beating the air-cooled version of it and meeting the next tier graphics card and beating it. Unfortunately, if you compare the price of this card though, it is significantly more expensive than the MSRP of an RTX 3090, which at that point, if you're comparing FPS per dollar, you should be beating it because you're paying more than that particular card. The downside of something like this is the fact that depending on the case that you have, you may not be able to fit a 240 in there. If you're running some sort of a CPU AIO, you have to hope that you have enough space to get this into the front of your case or the top of your case or vice versa. At some point, you're gonna have to have an intake radiator and an exhaust radiator in your system depending on what you're running. Fortunately, they give you a lot of tube length. Look at how long that is. I mean, they know right then and there that If you have to go all the way to the top of your case or all the way to the front of your case or potentially even the bottom of your case, which would be a very bad idea considering the fact that the pump is inside the cooler or the graphics card itself. So if you had it oriented like this in your case, that's going to make all of the people that have seen Steve's video about orientation just absolutely pop a gasket. So you're going to want to make sure that the radiator is higher than the graphics card wherever you can. Even if it's in the front of your case, as long as the inlet or the outlet tubes of the radiator are higher than the graphics card itself, then you're going to be perfectly fine in terms of air. The downside is, depending on your layout of your case, that may be difficult. The other thing you need to consider is the fact that this is an extremely tall card. You can see right here the bracket. This is the height of the standard RTX 3080. The PCB itself is that much taller than the bracket. So you can see there's a huge amount of height that you've got to think of right there. On top of that, you've got to think about the tubes themselves. You can't just crank those really tight and pinch them. So you've got to account for the radius of these tubes coming off the graphics card, as well as the power plugs. Now power plugs, you can sort of bend those fairly tight and get yourself some extra space. But tubing, you can't do that. The more you bend it, the more it's going to want to pinch these tubes. Not to mention, you don't want to put that kind of stress on the actual port itself because the port is coming out right there. So you don't want to crack it or break it because that's obviously going to lead to a problem. So that's about as tight as I think you could go with it. So if you take a look at how much depth that is, you're going to start having a lot of situations where certain cases that's probably going to impact either your tempered glass side panel, your plastic side panel, or just your metal panel. If vertical is an option, then this is going to start becoming a candidate for a vertical mount. So whereas AIOs are a really quick and easy implementation for going with keeping your card nice and cool, depending on the kind of card you go with, the kind of tubing it is, the size of the radiator, you might be adding a whole bunch of impractical things to consider in your system. Now, if you've got a full-size tower, that's going to be perfectly fine. Many mid-towers are going to be fine, but more importantly, it's the depth. If you can't fit yourself like a Noctua air cooler inside your system with how far that stands off of the motherboard, you probably would have a hard time fitting something like this. But nothing a Dremel can't fix, depending on the kind of person that you are. I'm the kind of person that would cut holes in something if I had to make something fit. But out of the box, it's going to be among the fastest graphics cards on the planet right now in terms of performance. Now, I don't know if they have a 3090 version of this so far. I don't think they do. But when it comes to just raw performance out of the box, this is clearly one of the fastest cards that you can get. Price, the subject we all hate talking about because pricing is something, it's just all over the board. So in terms of MSRP, we'll put a link down below so that you guys can go to the actual product page. I'm not actually sure what the MSRP is on this because it is quite all over the place in terms of pricing. In terms of the designs and the angular shapes and the fact that this all lights up with RGB, it's one of those where you get to have a water-cooled graphics card that looks nice, it's extremely fast, and I mean, the RGB definitely becomes part of the design and the aesthetic itself. A lot of people just aren't comfortable with going with custom water blocks on their extremely expensive graphics cards, whether it be a 3080 Ti or a 3060 Ti for that matter. Taking them apart and putting a water block on there and risk damaging it when the risk is really whether or not you can even find a replacement or even get an RMA replacement depending on the time of year that you guys are looking at this video, means that having a full AIO implemented edition like this is something that's definitely an incentive for people that want the performance uplift that you can get with water, now that it's becoming more relevant with the higher TDPs of these cards again. Making it a good option for those people. I say water cooling implementation makes sense again because as cards were getting faster and faster while staying with that 250 watt TDP that we were used to seeing for so many years, and the improvements of the AIOs and the size of them alone, now that we're seeing cards that were getting these big giant air coolers staying nearly as cool as water cooled cards, now that we're seeing 350 watt, 375, 400 watt versions of these cards, water starts to take the lead, obviously. Again, this card never got hotter than 49C during any of the testing that you saw here. We did test 1080p, but the reason why you don't see them on the charts is just because of the fact that CPU bottlenecks start to definitely become the limiting factor, where you start to see the 3090, the 3080 Ti, and the air-cooled and water-cooled cards just all kind of hitting the same ceiling because we've exceeded the capability of the 10900K, even overclocked, versus 1440p and 4K. This is not a card I would recommend for 1080p, even those that are doing like esports type gaming, because of the fact that you just are gonna hit crazy fluctuations in FPS when it comes to the CPU bottleneck, depending on the title. 1440p and 4K, it didn't matter what resolution, what features we were running, whether it be RTX, DLSS, which uses tensor cores, obviously, highest settings in games, the temperatures never exceeded 49. 50C, every now and then it would kind of peak up into there and come right back down to 49, which is it's a great performance for that particular type of power demand that you're seeing. In fact, even with my custom RTX 3090s that have full water blocks on them, open loops, all custom tubing and stuff, they get to the same temperature. So clearly the AIO at 240 is able to handle that. So anyway, there you go. That's the ROG Strix Gaming OC 12 gigabyte liquid cooled card. Would you guys put this in your system? And if so, what case would you run with it that would fit all of this stuff? Sound off in the comments below, guys. Thanks for watching. I know the GPU reviews are kind of meh at this point, but we still do them because if you do happen to see one on the shelf and you didn't see a review about it, then you'd be like, oh man. Although you'd probably buy whatever's on the shelf anyway at this point. So thanks for watching, guys, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.